In the summer of 1928, an Australian maritime officer named F.W. Christian stood on the deck of a small trading vessel, his binoculars trained on something that should not exist. Through the morning mist rising from the Pacific, he could see walls, massive structures of stone rising from the water like the ribs of some impossible beast. The vessel approached slowly, carefully navigating channels between artificial islands, each one constructed from stone so large that 100 men together could not lift them. Christian lowered his binoculars, his hands unsteady. He had sailed these waters for 15 years, had charted coastlines from Samoa to the Solomon Islands, had documented dozens of indigenous settlements. But nothing in his experience prepared him for what lay ahead. This was not a natural formation, not coral reef shaped by chance. This was construction on a scale that rivaled anything in Europe, built by people who, supposedly had no written language, no metal tools, no wheels, no knowledge of complex engineering. The locals called it Nan Madol. The name means spaces between in the Pohnpian language, referring to the canals that cut through the city like arteries. Christian had heard rumors of the place in port towns across Micronesia, whispered stories from sailors who spoke of a ghost city where no one lived, a cursed place avoided by the local population. He had dismissed the tales as superstition, the kind of mythology that grows around any ancient ruin in remote corners of the world. But standing there, watching the stone walls emerge from the Pacific as his vessel drew closer, Christian understood that the stories had failed to capture the reality. If anything, the rumors had diminished what actually existed here. The structures stretched across hundreds of yards, wall after wall of dark stone, each surface composed of logs of basalt stacked horizontally like timber in a frontier fort. The scale was monumental, the precision remarkable, the engineering sophisticated beyond anything that should exist on this remote speck of coral in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Christian stepped onto one of the artificial islands 30 minutes later, his boots touching stone that had not been designed to bear human weight in centuries. The walls around him rose 15 feet high, 5 feet thick, constructed from hexagonal columns of basalt that fit together with minimal gaps. There was no mortar, no binding agent visible between the stones. The structure held together through weight and precision alone, each piece placed so carefully that the walls had survived centuries of tropical storms, earthquakes, and the relentless assault of saltwater and time. He walked through a corridor between two walls, ran his hand along the basalt surface, felt the coolness of the stone, the slight roughness where ocean spray had weathered the outer layer. The columns were uniform in size, cut or selected to match, arranged in a crisscross pattern that provided stability and allowed water to flow through rather than build up pressure against the structure. It was brilliant engineering, the kind of design that suggested deep understanding of hydraulics, tidal forces, and structural integrity. But who built it? Christian had asked this question in every port before arriving. The Pohnpians he spoke with gave contradictory answers or refused to discuss Nan Madol at all. Some said it was built by the Sordla dynasty, rulers who had controlled the island hundreds of years before European contact. Others claimed it was far older, constructed by gods or spirits or twin sorcerers who flew the stones through the air using magic. The stories were elaborate, detailed, passed down through generations of oral tradition. But they agreed on one crucial point that troubled Christian deeply. No one knew how the stones were moved. The locals had no tradition of quarrying and transporting such massive blocks. The basalt came from the far side of Temwan Island, across 3 kilometers of jungle and coral reef. Each column weighed between 5 and 50 tons. There were an estimated 750,000 metric tons of stone in Nan Madol's construction. Even conservative calculations suggested that moving this volume of material would require thousands of workers, complex logistics, specialized equipment, and years of sustained effort. Christian examined the base of a wall where it met the coral platform. The platform itself was artificial, built up from coral rubble and smaller stones to create a foundation above the tidal zone. The engineering required to construct a stable platform on a living reef, to account for subsidence and coral growth, to ensure that the structure would not sink or shift over decades of use, was sophisticated. This was not the work of primitives experimenting with stone stacking. This was planned, executed by people who understood mathematics, weight distribution, and the behavior of materials under stress. He pulled a notebook from his jacket pocket, began sketching the wall structure, noting measurements and angles. The sketch was crude compared to the reality, but it captured the essential mystery. These walls, these platforms, these canals cutting between nearly 100 artificial islands, represented an investment of labor and knowledge that seemed impossible for the population of a small Pacific island. The conventional timeline said Nan Madol was built around 1200 CE, during the height of the Sordala dynasty. But even that recent date presented problems. The Sordala, according to local tradition, ruled Pohnpei for approximately 5 centuries before being overthrown by an invasion from the neighboring island of Khosri around 1628. They were remembered as powerful but oppressive rulers who centralized control of the island, who demanded tribute and labor from the population, who built Nan Madol as their ceremonial and administrative center. But the tradition also said that the Sordala came from elsewhere, that they were foreigners who arrived on Pohnpei and established their dynasty through superior knowledge and power. If the Sordala were immigrants, where did they come from? What civilization produced people with the engineering knowledge to build Nan Madol? The nearest islands with comparable stone architecture were thousands of miles away. Easter Island had its moai statues, but those were carved monuments, not habitable structures. The megalithic sites of Southeast Asia were even more distant, separated from Micronesia by vast stretches of open ocean that required sophisticated navigation to cross. Christian moved through Nan Madol over the following days, exploring islets that had different functions in the ancient city. There were residential compounds where the ruling class lived, raised platforms with stone buildings that once had thatched roofs. There were mortuary islets where the Sordala dead were interred, one massive tomb called Nan Dorwas, with walls that reached 25 feet in height and 17 feet in thickness. There were islets that appeared to be temples or ceremonial centers, open spaces surrounded by walls that focused attention inward. The largest structures occupied the northeastern section of the complex, designated by the Pohnpeians as Madol Pao, the lower cities associated with mortuary activities. The southwestern section, Madol Pa, was the upper city where the living conducted administrative and residential functions. The division suggested planning, a master design that organized space according to ritual and practical requirements. This was not organic growth, not buildings added randomly over generations. This was deliberate, conceived as a unified system before construction began. But the most troubling discovery came when Christian examined structures at the edges of the complex, walls and platforms that were partially submerged at high tide, foundations that clearly sat below the current water level. The tide in this region varied by several feet between high and low marks, but some of these structures were submerged even at low tide, visible only from boats or by diving into the channels. If they were built to be used by people, they must have been constructed when sea level was lower, when the coral reef sat higher relative to the ocean surface. Sea level in the Pacific had been relatively stable for the past 1,000 years, rising slowly due to thermal expansion and minor glacial melt. But 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, sea level was more than 300 feet lower than today. The coastlines were different, islands were larger or connected by land bridges, and reefs that now sat below the surface were dry land. If some of Nan Madol's structures were built when sea level was significantly lower, then the conventional dating was wrong. The city was not 800 years old. It was vastly older, built in a time when humans supposedly lived in small bands of hunter-gatherers, when civilization as we understand it did not exist. Christian documented this observation carefully, knowing it would be controversial. The archaeological establishment had constructed a clear timeline of human development in the Pacific, a narrative of gradual migration and cultural evolution. Nan Madol was supposed to fit neatly into that story as a relatively late development, an expression of chiefdom-level society building monumental architecture to express power and religious devotion. But the submerged structures, the sophisticated engineering, the scale of construction, and the absence of any developmental stages all suggested something different. They suggested that Nan Madol was not a beginning but possibly an ending, a remnant of something larger that had been lost. The stones themselves added to the mystery. Basalt is volcanic rock, formed when lava cools and solidifies. The particular type used at Nan Madol is columnar basalt, which forms naturally into hexagonal pillars as the cooling lava contracts. These columns can be quarried more easily than solid rock because they have natural breakpoints. But the nearest source of columnar basalt on Pohnpei is on the opposite side of Temwan Island from Nan Madol, across rugged terrain and shallow reefs. How were they transported? The conventional theory proposed that the builders used rafts made from logs or bamboo, floated the stones, at high tide through the reef passages, and positioned them on the artificial islands. But experiments attempting to replicate this method have failed. 50-ton basalt columns are remarkably difficult to balance on rafts without capsizing. The reef channels are shallow and treacherous, filled with sharp coral that would shred any organic material used for construction. And the precision required to position these massive stones, to build walls that have stood for centuries without mortar, suggests control and stability that floating rafts simply cannot provide. Christian stood at the edge of Nan Madol, the royal tomb, watching the tide rise through the channels below. Water poured between the basalt columns, flowing freely through the carefully engineered gaps in the walls. The city was designed to work with the water, not against it. The canals were thoroughfares, the islands were connected by boat, the entire complex functioned as an integrated system where water was not an obstacle but the primary means of movement and transportation. It was brilliant, sophisticated, and utterly mysterious in its origins. The local Pohnpeians avoided Nan Madol. They called it a cursed place, forbidden, guarded by spirits that punished those who disturbed the ruins. Christian had hired guides with difficulty, paying well above the normal rate, and even then the men refused to camp overnight on the islets. They returned to Temwan Island or the main settlement on Pohnpei before dark, leaving Christian alone among the stones, to make his observations and sketches. The fear was genuine, rooted in traditions that stretched back generations. Something had happened at Nan Madol, something terrible enough that centuries later, the descendants of those who witnessed it still taught their children to stay away. The question that haunted Christian, the question he wrote in his journal as the tropical sun set behind the walls of basalt and the channels filled with shadow, was simple and unanswerable. Who built Nan Madol? Not the name of a dynasty or a culture, but the actual people who quarried these stones, who transported them across impossible distances, who engineered platforms on living coral reefs, who constructed walls with precision that modern builders struggle to match. Where did they come from, what knowledge did they possess, and what happened to them that was so catastrophic their descendants can only speak of curses and spirits when asked about this place? 92 million tons of stone sat arranged in patterns on a coral reef in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The stones were real, solid, measurable. The walls stood 15 feet high in places, perfectly preserved by the dry tropical air and the absence of human interference. The engineering was sophisticated, the scale monumental, the purpose clear. This was a city, a capital, a center of power and ceremony that once housed hundreds or thousands of people who conducted the business of ruling an island society. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, carved in basalt that could not lie. But the answers, the explanations for how and why and who, remained hidden in the spaces between the stones, in the channels where the tide flowed twice daily, in the legends that spoke of flying dragons, and sorcerers and powers that no longer existed in the world. Christian closed his notebook, packed his surveying equipment, and prepared to leave Nan Madol as darkness fell completely over the ruins. The mystery would outlive him, would persist long after his sketches were filed away in museum archives, would continue to challenge every assumption about what ancient peoples could accomplish and what knowledge might have been lost to time and catastrophe. The stones would remain silent witnesses to a history no one could fully read, monuments to builders whose names and methods had vanished as completely as if they had never existed at all. Based on the file samples and research, here is part 2 with approximately 15,000 characters, continuing the narrative style. This is segment content. The engineer's name was William Ayres, and he stood in the quarry site on the western side of Temwan Island in 1982, examining the marks left by ancient stone workers who had extracted basalt columns from the living rock. The quarry was small, just a depression in the hillside where columnar basalt erupted from the ground, in natural hexagonal formations, the result of volcanic lava cooling slowly millions of years earlier. Ayres ran his hand along the breakpoints where columns had been removed, felt the rough texture of fractured stone, tried to imagine the process that had separated these massive pieces from their bedrock foundation. The basalt columns at Nan Madol averaged 12 feet in length, 18 inches in diameter, and weighed approximately 5 tons each. The larger columns, the ones used in the walls of Nan doors and other major structures, could reach 20 feet and weigh 50 tons or more. Ayres had spent months calculating the logistics required to move stones of this size across the 3 kilometers that separated the quarry from the construction site. Every calculation led to the same conclusion, a conclusion that troubled him because it contradicted what was supposed to be possible with the tools available to the builders. The conventional explanation, the one repeated in archaeological texts and tourist brochures, said the stones were floated on rafts at high tide, guided through the reef channels, and positioned on the artificial islands during construction. It sounded plausible in the abstract, reasonable when described in a paragraph without details. But Ayres was an engineer, trained to think in terms of forces and weights, friction and buoyancy, the physical realities that governed how materials behaved under stress. And the physics of the conventional explanation did not work. A basalt column weighing 5 tons displaces approximately 2 cubic meters of water when submerged. To keep such a stone afloat on a raft requires that the raft itself displace enough additional water to support both its own weight and the weight of the stone. Using bamboo or wood available on Pohnpei, a raft capable of floating a 5-ton stone would need to be at least 20 feet long and 10 feet wide, constructed from dozens of logs lashed together with rope made from coconut fiber or other plant materials. The raft would sit low in the water, perhaps 6 inches of freeboard separating the stone from submersion. Ayres had attempted to build such a raft as an experiment, using materials and techniques available to pre-contact Pacific Islanders. The construction took 3 days with a team of 6 people, required hundreds of feet of rope, and produced a structure that was barely stable in calm water. When they attempted to load a 5-ton concrete block onto the raft as a test, the structure immediately became unstable, tipping to one side as the weight shifted. They tried different configurations, different lashing patterns, different placements of the stone. None worked reliably. The raft would tip, the stone would slide, and the entire assembly would capsize or fall apart under stress. And that was in a controlled test pool with calm water, no current, no wind, and a concrete block with regular dimensions. The reef channels between the quarry site and Nan Madol were shallow, rarely more than 6 feet deep, at high tide, filled with sharp coral that would tear through bamboo and would within minutes of contact. The currents through these channels were strong, driven by tidal flows that moved millions of gallons of water twice daily. The wind in this region came from the northeast trade winds, steady but unpredictable in strength, capable of creating surface chop that would destabilize any raft carrying a top-heavy load. Ayres calculated that successfully transporting a single 5-ton column from quarry to construction site using raft methods would require perfect conditions, skilled coordination, constant attention to balance, and extraordinary luck. The probability of completing the journey without capsizing or running aground on coral was perhaps 50% for a single stone. For 50 stones, the probability of moving all of them successfully dropped to essentially zero. And Nan Madol contained not 50 stones but an estimated 750,000 tons of basalt, representing perhaps 250,000 individual columns if averaged at 3 tons each. The numbers were impossible. Even if the raft method worked perfectly, even if every stone arrived safely, the labor required would be staggering. A team of 10 people could perhaps move 1 stone per day if everything went right. To move 250,000 stones would require 250,000 days, divided by 10 people working continuously, equals 25,000 work days per person. Divided by 300 working days per year accounting for weather and other activities, this equals 83 years of continuous labor for a team of 10. To complete the project in a reasonable timeframe, say 20 years, would require a workforce of more than 40 people dedicated solely to stone transportation, with additional workers for quarrying, construction, and all the support activities required to feed and house such a labor force. Pohnpei's population in pre-contact times is estimated at perhaps 25,000 people total, spread across the entire island, in small coastal settlements. The idea that this population could spare 40 people for continuous labor over decades, plus the additional workers required for other aspects of construction, plus the farmers and fishermen needed to produce food surplus to feed non-productive laborers, strained credibility. The social organization required to coordinate such an effort, to maintain it over generations, to ensure that knowledge and skills passed from one group of workers to the next, suggested a level of centralized authority and economic sophistication that left no other traces in the archaeological record. Ayres examined the base of one of the walls at Nan Madol, where massive columns had been laid horizontally, in a crisscross pattern, each layer perpendicular to the one below. The engineering was elegant, simple in concept but requiring precision in execution. Each column had to be placed so that its weight distributed evenly, so that the structure remained balanced as layers accumulated, so that the final wall could support its own mass plus the additional stress from wind and wave action. There was no mortar, no binding agent to hold the stones together. The structure relied entirely on weight, friction, and careful placement. He measured the gaps between columns with calipers, recorded dimensions in his notebook. The gaps were remarkably consistent, averaging less than 2 centimeters across most joints. This consistency suggested either very careful selection of stones, choosing only those with matching dimensions, or some method of shaping the columns to standardized sizes. Natural columnar basalt varies in diameter, with individual columns ranging from 6 inches to 3 feet across depending on the cooling rate of the original lava flow. The columns at Nan Madol showed less variation than would be expected from random selection, clustering around the 18-inch diameter mark, with only minor deviations. If the builders were selecting stones for consistency, they would need to quarry many more columns than they actually used, rejecting those that did not fit the required dimensions. This would multiply the transportation problem, requiring the movement of perhaps twice as many stones as appear in the final structures. If they were shaping the stones, they would need tools capable of working basalt, one of the hardest rocks available, with enough precision to maintain consistent diameters across 12-foot lengths. Neither possibility fit with the tool inventory known from Pohnpeian archaeology, which consisted primarily of shell and coral implements with a few examples of polished stone adzes. Ayres walked along the wall, examining the construction technique in detail. The columns were laid in alternating orientations, header and stretcher pattern, with some columns running perpendicular to the wall face and others parallel to it. This pattern, familiar from brick construction, provided structural stability by interlocking the layers so that vertical joints did not align between courses. It was sophisticated engineering, the kind of technique that develops over time through trial and error, through experience with smaller structures that teach the principles before they are applied at monumental scale. But there were no smaller structures, no developmental sequence visible in the archaeological record. Nan Madol appeared fully formed, built with techniques that showed mastery from the first courses laid. The earliest construction phases, dated by radiocarbon to around 1000 CE, showed the same level of sophistication as the later phases built 200 years afterward. There was no learning curve, no progression from crude experiments to refined technique. The knowledge required to build Nan Madol seemed to arrive complete, possessed by people who had either developed these skills elsewhere before coming to Pompeii or inherited them from a tradition that left no other visible traces. The alternative explanations, the ones whispered by local guides and repeated in fringe archaeology books, involved magic and supernatural assistance. The Pompeian oral traditions were explicit on this point, insisting that the stones were not carried by human labor but flew through the air, levitated by the power of twin sorcerers named Olasipa and Olasopa. The sorcerers, according to legend, came from a place called Katau or Sornaling to the west, brought with them dragons or supernatural forces that could move massive stones without physical effort, and used these powers to construct Nan Madol as the seat of the Sordla dynasty they founded. Ayres did not believe in magic or levitation, but he took the legends seriously as potential repositories of historical memory. Oral traditions often preserve accurate information across generations, encoding real events in mythological language that survives cultural changes and the passage of time. If the legend said the builders came from the West and possessed knowledge or technology that seemed supernatural to local observers, there might be a kernel of truth embedded in the supernatural trappings. The West, from Pompeii's perspective, included the island chains of the Carolines, the Philippines, Indonesia, all the way to mainland Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. Perhaps the builders were migrants from one of these regions, people who brought with them construction techniques developed in their homeland and applied them in this remote Pacific location. This migration theory had problems of its own. The nearest stone architecture comparable to Nan Madol was thousands of miles away in Southeast Asia or Indonesia, regions that had developed megalithic construction traditions during the first millennium CE. But those traditions used different techniques, different architectural styles, different stone types. The megalithic sites of Indonesia featured carved menhirs and dolmens, not the columnar basalt constructions of Nan Madol. The connection was plausible in broad terms, suggesting a diffusion of ideas about monumental stone architecture, but the specific techniques and materials were different enough to indicate independent development rather than direct cultural transmission. Ayres climbed to the top of the Nan Doors wall, stood 25 feet above the coral platform, looked out across the complex of artificial islands stretching in all directions. From this height, the pattern became clear. The islands were arranged in a rough grid, separated by channels that ran northeast to southwest, aligned with the prevailing trade winds and tidal currents. The largest structures, Nan Doors and Panwi and Pankadira, occupied strategic positions within the grid, marking out a hierarchy of importance that must have corresponded to ritual or political significance. The city was designed to function with water, not despite it. The channels were thoroughfares, navigable at high tide by outrigger canoe, allowing movement between islands without the need for bridges or causeways. The walls were permeable, built with gaps that allowed water to flow through rather than creating dam pools that would stagnate and breed disease. The entire complex breathed with the tide, filling and emptying twice daily, maintaining water quality through constant circulation. It was brilliant hydraulic engineering, the kind of design that required deep understanding of tidal dynamics, water flow, and the behavior of coral reef ecosystems. But it also meant that much of Nan Madol's construction had to happen underwater, or, at least in the intertidal zone where work could only proceed during low tide windows. The foundations of the artificial island sat on coral reef, platforms built up from coral rubble and smaller stones to create a base above the normal high tide line. Building these foundations required working in water, placing stones by feel or in the brief hours when the tide exposed the reef surface. The precision required to create level platforms on uneven coral, to ensure that foundations would not settle or shift under the weight of the walls above, was extraordinary. Ayres had examined core samples taken from the foundations during an earlier survey. The coral rubble was carefully graded, with larger pieces at the bottom and progressively smaller material toward the top, creating a stable base that distributed weight evenly and allowed water to drain through rather than pooling beneath the structures. The technique was sophisticated, showing understanding of soil mechanics and foundation engineering that seemed out of place for a culture that supposedly had no writing, no formal education system, no way to preserve and transmit technical knowledge except through oral tradition and hands-on apprenticeship. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the basalt walls, turning the stone from grey to deep purple in the fading light. Ayres packed his measuring tools, made final notes in his journal, prepared to leave Nan Madol before darkness made navigation through the channels dangerous. He had spent 6 months at the site, documenting construction techniques, recording measurements, attempting to understand how this place was built. His conclusion, the one he would write in his formal report and present to the archaeological community, was carefully worded, academically cautious. The construction of Nan Madol, he would write, represents a significant engineering achievement requiring substantial labor investment, sophisticated organizational capacity, and technical knowledge of stone construction and hydraulic engineering. The methods by which the builders quarried, transported, and positioned the basalt columns remain incompletely understood and merit further investigation. What he would not write, what he could not put in an academic paper without destroying his credibility, was simpler and more troubling. He did not know how Nan Madol was built. Despite months of study, despite engineering analysis and experimental archaeology, despite measurements and calculations and careful observation, the basic question remained unanswered. The conventional explanations did not work, could not account for the scale and precision of what had been accomplished. And the alternative explanations, the legends of flying stones and supernatural power, were unacceptable to modern science regardless of how persistent and detailed those legends might be. 92 million tons of stone sat arranged on coral reef, built into walls and platforms and chambers that had survived 7 centuries of tropical storms, earthquakes, and the relentless assault of saltwater. The stones were there, undeniable, precisely placed, expertly engineered. But the explanation for how they came to be there, for how people without metal tools or wheeled vehicles or documented engineering tradition could accomplish such a feat, remained hidden in the spaces between the columns, in the channels where the tide flowed, in the quarry marks that showed extraction but not transportation, in the foundations that demonstrated skill but not source. The mystery was architectural, physical, carved in basalt that could not lie about its weight or the distances it had traveled. And the mystery remained unsolved, challenging every assumption about what ancient people could accomplish and what methods might have been lost to time. The geologist's name was Arthur Sachs, and he stood on the deck of a research vessel in 1978, watching a diver disappear beneath the surface of the Pacific just offshore from Nan Madol. The water was clear, visibility extending perhaps 80 feet in the morning light, enough to see the diver's silhouette as he descended along the anchor line toward the seafloor 25 meters below. Sachs checked his watch, noted the time in his logbook, waited for the diver to reach the bottom, and begin the survey that might answer questions that had troubled him since he first heard the Pohnpeian legends about sunken cities beneath the waves. The legend spoke of two underwater settlements, Karnim Namket and Karnahuezo, cities that had existed before Nan Madol, cities that had sunk beneath the ocean through catastrophe or divine punishment. The stories were specific, giving locations and describing stone structures similar to those visible above water at Nan Madol itself. Sachs was skeptical by training, a scientist who required physical evidence before accepting extraordinary claims. But he was also curious, intrigued by the possibility that Nan Madol might be only the visible portion of a larger complex, that the structures on land might represent the final phase of construction while, earlier, buildings lay hidden beneath the waves. The diver's voice crackled through the underwater communication system, distorted by the water but comprehensible. He had reached the bottom, was moving along the planned survey line, scanning the seafloor with lights and cameras. Sachs listened, marked the diver's position on a chart, waited for reports of what lay below. Minutes passed. The diver's breathing was audible through the speaker, steady and controlled, the sound of someone working methodically through a planned sequence of observations. Then the diver's voice changed, excitement breaking through the professional calm. He had found something, a vertical structure rising from the seafloor, covered in coral growth but clearly artificial in shape. The description matched the legends, a stone pillar standing upright in 25 meters of water, too regular to be natural, too well preserved to be ancient. Sachs felt his pulse quicken, made notes as the diver provided dimensions. The pillar was approximately 6 meters tall, roughly 1 meter in diameter, positioned alone on a sandy bottom, with no other structures immediately visible. The diver moved to a second location, following the survey pattern, found another pillar, then a third. They were scattered across the seafloor in no obvious pattern, standing like sentinels in the deep water, their surfaces encrusted with coral that had grown over centuries or millennia. Sachs calculated depths, considered the implications. If these pillars were part of a constructed settlement, if they had been placed deliberately by human builders, they must have been erected when sea level was significantly lower than today, when the current seafloor was dry land or shallow reef accessible to construction crews. Sea level has not been constant over geological time. During the last ice age, which ended approximately 12,000 years ago, massive ice sheets covered much of North America and Europe, locking up so much water that global sea level was more than 300 feet lower than today. Coastlines were different, islands were larger, and areas that are now underwater were habitable land. As the ice melted, sea level rose, drowning coastal settlements, flooding river valleys, transforming the geography of continents. The rise was not uniform, occurring in pulses separated by periods of relative stability, but the overall trend was inexorable. Land that had been home to human communities for thousands of years disappeared beneath the waves, taking with it any structures or artifacts that had been built there. If the underwater pillars at Nan Madol dated from this period, if they were remnants of construction from before the post-glacial sea level rise, then they were vastly older than the accepted chronology suggested. The conventional dating for Nan Madol's construction was around 1180 CE, based on radiocarbon analysis of charcoal found in the coral rubble foundations and uranium-thorium dating of coral samples taken from the artificial islands. This dating placed Nan Madol in the late medieval period, contemporary with Gothic cathedrals in Europe and the Mongol Empire in Asia. It was ancient by human standards but well within recorded history, built by people whose descendants could trace their lineage back to the original builders. But sea level 1200 years ago was nearly identical to sea level today, varying by perhaps a meter or two due to local tectonic activity and minor climate fluctuations. Structures built in 1180 CE at sea level would still be at or near sea level today, not submerged under 25 meters of water. For the pillars to be underwater at their current depth, they would need to have been built when sea level was 25 meters lower, which meant at least 8,000 years ago, possibly much older depending on the exact depth and the local rate of subsidence. Sachs faced a contradiction. The pillars were there, photographed and measured, undeniably real. But their depth contradicted the accepted chronology of Nan Madol's construction. Either the pillars were not artificial, were natural coral formations or geological features misinterpreted as human construction, or the chronology was wrong, incomplete, missing an earlier phase of building that predated the Sordler dynasty by thousands of years. The implications of the second possibility were profound, suggesting that Pompeii had been home to a sophisticated culture, capable of monumental stone construction in the deep past, a culture that had disappeared or been forgotten by the time the Sordler arrived and built the structures visible above water. The diver completed his survey, returned to the surface, climbed aboard the research vessel with his cameras and notes. The photographs showed the pillars clearly, vertical columns rising from sand, their surfaces encrusted with coral polyps and algae, their shapes too regular to be natural. Sachs examined the images closely, looked for details that would confirm artificial construction, for tool marks or jointing or any evidence that these were worked stone rather than naturally occurring formations. The coral growth obscured the surface, made definitive identification difficult. To know for certain, they would need to core the pillars, to extract samples that could be analyzed for composition and structure. The team conducted additional dives over the following days, mapped the distribution of pillars, recorded positions and dimensions, collected samples where possible. They found more structures, at least a dozen pillars scattered across several hundred square meters of seafloor, plus what appeared to be fallen stones, blocks lying horizontal on the sand that might have been displaced from walls or platforms. The pattern suggested a constructed site that extended offshore from the visible ruins of Nan Madol, possibly representing an earlier phase of settlement or an extension of the ceremonial center into what was then shallow water or land. But they did not find the legendary cities, did not discover the massive complexes described in oral tradition. Karnim Namket and Karna Hueso, if they had ever existed, remained hidden, either buried under sediment, destroyed by wave action, or located in areas the survey had not yet covered. The search would require more time, more resources, more systematic exploration of the seafloor around Pompeii. Sachs wrote his preliminary report, documented the pillars, noted the depth paradox, recommended further investigation. The report was read by specialists, filed in archaeological archives, cited occasionally in papers about Pacific prehistory. But the funding for follow-up research did not materialize. The questions raised by the underwater pillars remained unanswered. 10 years later, in 1988, another research team returned to Pompeii, with better equipment, more sophisticated mapping tools, and a determination to resolve the mystery of the underwater structures. They located the pillars Sachs had documented, examined them with high-resolution cameras, took core samples for analysis. The core samples were processed in laboratories, cut into sections, examined under microscopes. The results were disappointing and unambiguous. The pillars were not basalt, were not worked stone at all. They were coral, solid coral formations that had grown vertically from the seafloor, their columnar shapes the result of natural growth patterns rather than human construction. The team published their findings, concluded that the underwater pillars were biological rather than artificial, that Sachs's survey had misidentified natural coral formations as man-made structures. The conclusion was defensible, supported by physical evidence, accepted by the archaeological community. But it raised new questions even as it answered old ones. If the pillars were natural, why had they grown in vertical columns? Coral typically grows in irregular mounds or branching structures, following the substrate and available light. Vertical columns were possible but unusual, requiring specific environmental conditions and sustained growth over centuries. And why were they located specifically offshore from Nan Madol, in the area where legend said ancient cities had sunk? The team also investigated reports of other underwater features, used sonar to map the seafloor, searched for evidence of submerged structures or artificial modifications to the reef. They found prone basalt columns lying on the seafloor, blocks that had clearly fallen or been discarded from the construction process at Nan Madol, washed into deeper water by storms or tides. These were definitely artificial, worked stone that had been quarried and shaped, but they were isolated pieces, not part of any coherent underwater structure. The team concluded they were lost building materials, stones that never reached their intended positions, in the walls above, casualties of the construction process that had been ongoing for centuries. In 2013, a Japanese research group conducted the most comprehensive underwater survey yet attempted, using multibeam sonar, remotely operated vehicles, and detailed scuba diving investigations. They mapped the entire offshore area surrounding Nan Madol with precision, recorded every feature on the seafloor, investigated anomalies that might represent artificial structures. They also explored a blue hole, a deep circular depression in the reef that local legend identified as the site where Kana Hueso had collapsed and sunk into a subterranean cavern. The blue hole was dramatic, a vertical shaft descending more than 30 meters below the surrounding seafloor, its walls lined with coral and marine growth, its depths dark even in midday sun. The ROV descended into the hole, transmitted images from depths where human divers could not safely venture. The bottom was sediment, sand, and coral rubble that had accumulated over thousands of years, no trace of buildings or artificial structures visible in the deposits. The geological analysis concluded that the blue hole was a sinkhole, formed during periods of low sea level when freshwater had dissolved the limestone reef from below, creating caverns that eventually collapsed. The collapse was natural, not related to human activity, and had occurred long before any settlement on Pohnpei. The 2013 survey found no evidence of underwater cities, no submerged buildings, no artificial structures, at depths that would require construction during lower sea levels. The prone basalt columns were confirmed as discarded building materials, the coral pillars were natural formations, and the blue hole was a geological feature. The comprehensive negative findings seemed to close the case, to eliminate the possibility that Nan Madol extended significantly underwater or represented the visible portion of a much older and larger complex. The legends of sunken cities were just legends, stories invented to explain natural features or memories of storms that had damaged coastal settlements. But carbon dating and uranium-thorium dating told a more complex story. Samples collected from the foundations of Nan Madol's artificial islands showed a range of dates, not the uniform age expected, from a single construction period. The earliest dates came from Oahu, an islet near the center of the complex, where charcoal at the base of the coral rubble foundation yielded radiocarbon dates clustering around 80 to 200 CE, more than 1,000 years before the accepted beginning of megalithic construction. The later phases, the massive basalt walls and platforms that define Nan Madol's appearance today, dated consistently to the period between 1180 and 1400 CE, matching the historical record of the Sordler dynasty. The interpretation of these dates was contentious. Some archaeologists argued that the early dates represented pre-Sordler settlement on Pohnpei, small communities living on the reef before the construction of monumental architecture began, their cooking fires leaving charcoal deposits that became incorporated into the later foundations. The early settlers might have built modest structures, wooden houses on coral platforms, but nothing approaching the scale of what came later. The megalithic construction was a later development, an innovation or imported technique that appeared around 1180 CE and transformed the site from a simple settlement into the impressive ceremonial center that survived to the present. Others suggested that the early dates indicated an earlier phase of monumental construction, that Nan Madol had been built in stages over more than a millennium, that the Sordler dynasty represented the final and most elaborate phase but not the beginning. This interpretation required accepting that some structures were much older than they appeared, that foundations beneath the visible walls dated from the early centuries CE, that the site had been continuously occupied and rebuilt over 1,000 years. It was possible, consistent with the dating evidence, but difficult to prove without extensive excavation, that might damage the structures and was prohibited by their status as a protected archaeological site. The geological evidence added another layer of complexity. Pompeii sits on a volcanic foundation, part of the Caroline Islands chain formed by hotspot volcanism millions of years ago. The island is slowly subsiding, sinking at a rate of approximately 1 to 2 millimeters per year as the ocean crust beneath it cools and contracts. Over the past 1,000 years, this subsidence would have lowered the island by 1 to 2 meters relative to sea level, enough to submerge structures that were originally built at the high tide line. Over 10,000 years, the subsidence would total 10 to 20 meters, potentially explaining why some features appear to be underwater when they should be on land. But subsidence alone could not account for structures at 25-meter depths unless they were built more than 10,000 years ago, pushing the chronology back into the early Holocene when Pompeii's population would have been small or non-existent according to conventional archaeological models. The contradiction remained unresolved, balanced between physical evidence that suggested great age and dating evidence that indicated recent construction, between legends that spoke of sunken cities and surveys that found only natural formations and discarded building materials. The debate continued in academic journals, at conferences, in conversations between researchers who had spent careers studying Pacific prehistory. The questions multiplied faster than answers. How old was Nan Madol really? Did it have earlier phases buried beneath the visible structures or submerged, offshore? Why did legends insist on underwater cities if none existed? What caused the Sordler dynasty to collapse, and Nan Madol to be abandoned? And most fundamentally, what did this site represent in the larger pattern of human development in the Pacific, the story of migration and settlement and cultural evolution that had populated islands across the world's largest ocean? The stones provided some answers but concealed others. They confirmed that sophisticated construction had occurred, that engineering knowledge existed, that social organization was capable of mobilizing labor for monumental projects. But they did not reveal dates definitively, did not explain contradictions, did not resolve mysteries about earlier phases or underwater extensions. The dating was precise within its limits, accurate to decades or centuries using modern analytical techniques. But dating told when coral had been harvested or charcoal had burned, not when stones had been quarried or walls had been built. The gap between physical evidence and historical interpretation remained wide, filled with speculation and competing theories that could not be tested without destructive excavation or technological breakthroughs that did not yet exist. 25 meters below the surface, coral continued to grow on pillars that might be natural or might mark locations where artificial structures had once stood. Above the water, 92 million tons of basalt sat precisely arranged on artificial islands, monuments to engineering capability and cultural ambition. Between the underwater coral and the visible ruin stretched a chronological gap, 1,000 years or 10,000, depending on which evidence was privileged and which was explained away. The mystery was geological now, technical, a matter of dating techniques and subsidence rates and the interpretation of scattered data points. But beneath the technical questions lay the same fundamental puzzle that had troubled F.W. Christian in 1928 and Arthur Sachs in 1978, the puzzle that continued to resist solution despite decades of research and increasingly sophisticated analysis. Something remarkable had happened at Nan Madol, something that pushed the boundaries of what should have been possible for the people and technology available at the time. The stones could not lie about their weight or their precision. but they remain silent about their age and their builder's true identity. The legend of Nan Madol's first rulers always lands softly, like a secret shared at midnight. It does not begin with iron or war, but with the hush of oars in the fog and two figures, strangers, gliding into the sight of villagers who could not know their own fate was changing. No one can agree on the precise day or season, or even how many watched that meeting, but all tellers agree the twins Olasipa and Olasopa came from a place that exists only in stories. Some people whisper of Kata far to the west, a land that may be real, might be a vanished island, or just another word for origin. These men stood tall, or seemed to, they asked little, spoke soft, and their eyes weighed one's soul. Every legend needs a mission. The twins, bearing no weapons, said they were sent by the god Nanasan Sarp to build an altar that could endure waves, winds, and the test of faith. With them, the world bristled with possibility, fresh, raw, as vulnerable as dawn. At first, all was struggle. Each structure raised was swept away by tide, toppled by storms, or shaken apart by the ground itself. Failure tested, but it did not quit them. Instead, the failures pulled more villagers into the purpose, more hands into the labor, more ears into the quiet by firesides at night. Something changed at the seventh try. Perhaps the gods felt the resolve, perhaps just a rare pause in the weather, or perhaps it was magic. In the telling, the world bent for the twins. At their sung command, basalt columns heavy as despair, black and sharp as memory rose, hovered in air, and floated to the build site as if conjured. Whether this was a literal levitation or the memory of ingenious engineering, no one now can say. But the stones were set, the altar finally stood, unbowed to storm and sea. With this, the story changes. Hope surges with the rising tide. Islanders gather, willing now to believe what they had seen. The new altar is not an end, but a beginning. Olasipa and Olasopa lead the work, chanting, directing, solving the puzzle of stones and sea. Basalt is quarried on the far end of Temwen, dragged, rolled, floated, or perhaps just willed across impossible distances. Pillars are stacked like cordwood, layers cross-hatched. Islets blossom across the reef. The city, once just a vision, becomes flesh. Nan Madol, a new world, made with sweat and with the secret help of spirits. The city lives and grows because people want to believe in miracles. An altar to Nanasan Sarp soon becomes many altars, then a palace, then a court, then a city within water, a spider web of structure and silence ringed by the restless Pacific. All the while, the brothers guide, solve, and settle disputes. Communities shift from hills to islets. Tributes flow in from fisherfolk and gardeners. Under the gaze of the twins, peace seems as certain as sunrise. But time gnaws at the edge of every piece. Olasipa, feeling age or simply the fatigue that follows ecstasy, dies. The people mourn. Olasopa, left alone, cements his rule by marrying a local woman of high status. From their children's children, a new royal line thickens across Pohnpei the Swordler. What began in legend solidifies into law. For generations, the Swordler kings are remembered as wise and generous. They demand tribute, but only as proof of loyalty and gratitude. Islanders dance, sing, and enter the basalt courts with heads high. The tide that once threatened is managed, the canals shimmer with morning light and passing canoes. Stone platforms rise, each fancier than the last. The city becomes a magnet for talent, devotion, and ambition. Yet the story always bends. Prosperity invites pride. As generations trickle down, the Swordler grow distant. Tribute becomes tax, a duty not joy. Nobles from rival clans are pulled into Nan Madol. Some are flattered, some are hostages in all but name. The capital becomes a cage. Rights deepen, fewer are allowed to participate. Priests serve the king they scry omens from the darkness, warning that rituals must be stricter, that fault must be punished, that old gods must give way to the dynasty's chosen. Walls and temples multiply, not only to glorify, but to contain, segregate, and surveil. Where the city once united, now it divides. Families are cut off from their pasts. Culture, like the canal water, becomes stagnant in places, too deep, choked with the weeds of secret resentment. The king, whoever he is at this time, rules with fear as much as wisdom. Spies slip between houses, secrets are currency, and dissent is punished quickly with exile or death. Festivals that once joined the island in celebration become tense, brittle, as minor slights risk public ruin. People bow lower, smile less. Tribute piles higher inside the sacred city. Of the altar of Nanus and Sarp, less and less is remembered. Now all things must pass through the swordler, now all good fortune belongs to the dynasty alone. From distant villages, 100 quiet protests begin. Parents tell children not the city's wonders, but the limits of trust. Chiefs exchange tired jokes about empty granaries and full storehouses behind basalt walls. Discontent crawls like shadow through twilight. Some say old spirits, once driven away, begin to return, sickness in gardens, phantom lights on the waves, fish refusing nets. Some outsiders, seeing the changes, carry tales to other islands. In the spaces between control, hope and rebellion gather shape. Every darkness invites a figure to challenge it. Isokellical arrives in legend like a storm in human form, sometimes divine, sometimes mortal, always necessary. He sails from Khosri, it is said, bringing warriors, or allies, or just the pent-up hope of the desperate. He unites the old chiefs. He practices old rites in secret, invokes forgotten gods, whispers murder even as he promises justice. It is not the first rebellion, but it is the last to succeed. The final days come as whispered lines, the king grows paranoid, summons all power to the city's heart, while Isokellical picks at every weak seam. Betrayal by insiders, whispers past in temple shadows. The canals, once highways for tribute, ferry in the agents of change. The city's guardians falter. On one night made bright by thunder in some tellings, shrouded in unnatural stillness in others, the swordler's end is sealed. Whether the king is slain, flees to the forest, or drowns in the sea, the result is the same. The dynasty collapses. The old altars, now orphaned, grow moss. Islanders leave, return to the hills, to the smaller villages, to the ways older than kings. Nan Madol empties. Where hundreds bustled, now only the wind and the waves move stones. The swordler legacy endures not in writing, not in gold, but in silence and stone. Their story is all that is left told, not as pride, but as warning. Power gained with magic or vision can end in overreach. Goodness hardened into law becomes tyranny. Canal water, managed for centuries, returns to claim the city, washing it back into the patient sea. Visitors now wander the broken islets, marveling or shivering, seeking wisdom in the way the stones still balance, in the canals that still flood and drain. Guides walk only in daylight, their voices hushed after sunset. The city is a riddle, its lessons layered, its end both cautionary and inevitable. Even the story of the twins pulses in the background. Did they wield miracles, or simply harness will? Was their mission righteous, or the first step toward a pride that doomed their children? In the ruins, as dusk falls, the old questions echo about leadership, about hubris, about where magic ends and memory begins. Every stone is a secret, every canal a whisper, every altar a failed promise. The swordler are gone. The city, like the legend, is left for others to interpret, to enter, or to fear. When a city dies, rarely does it happen all at once. Even the greatest capitals of history, Babylon, Rome, anchor fade with a mix of fire, myth, longing, and slow retreat. But the fall of Nan Madol is a silence far deeper than most. Visitors today feel it an emptiness more profound than ruins alone can provide. After the Sordeler's abrupt fall, a thick hush settles over the stone city. Islanders tell of rain that first came softly, then in bucketing sheets, sluicing silt into the canals and causing the tides to lap ever higher at the walls. At night, mist coils and lingers among the basalt, murmuring with secrets only the bravest children dare to overhear. No more festival drums echo across the water. No processions ferry gifts to temples. The air is thick only with the chorus of frogs and the creak and groan of the swamp reclaiming its own. Some say Isokelical, the conqueror, stayed a season in the palace, holding audiences with the remaining chiefs, trying to rule a kingdom made wary and brittle by too many years of enforced unity. But even his ambitions faltered. The city's power was its spectacle, and with the defeat of the Sordeler, neither reverence nor fear kept anyone loyal to its empty ceremonial heart. The chiefs, given a taste of independence, drifted back to their home valleys, eager to revive the customs stifled for generations. The priesthood scattered. Some resettled in the upland forests. Others adapted, shifting their rites to smaller clan shrines, blending old Sordeler rituals with the beliefs of past times. The stone courts were left to the caprice of the tide, the slow creep of vines, the heartbreak of being forgotten. Some families, out of necessity or stubborn memory, lingered on the outskirts fishing the canals, gathering medicine, in the shadow of abandoned walls, whispering apologies to the spirit said to guard every causeway and altar. Stories filtered outward at first small rumors, then claims so strange and chilling that no one dared doubt them. Island children, venturing to Nan Madol as part of adolescent dares, reported seeing pale figures drifting over the water, at night, too tall for mortals, their faces indistinct. Others described fires appearing where none could be lit, blue and white and wavering as if fueled by the breath of invisible mourners. Most who heard these tales withdrew into themselves, adding a new taboo on top of many older ones: do not stay at Nan Madol after sunset. More disturbing were the memories of those who tried to settle within the ruins. Fishermen who camped for an early start, herbalists who sought rare roots by the moonlight, almost all returned, with stories of sudden chills, unaccountable noises, and, sometimes, the abrupt loss of memory, as, though the city itself wanted nothing of the living. There were even reports of boats tipping for no clear reason, supplies vanishing, voices whispering warnings in foreign accents. This, perhaps more than legend, was the work of absence, the city so full of presence that anything less than reverence was met with subtle resistance. In time, a new geography of fear mapped the ruins. The outer islets, where the walls were lowest and the water shallow, became the closest anyone would regularly approach. The inner sanctuaries, especially the highest wall tombs, became places only priests or the desperate would risk entering. On festival days, instead of pageantry, people performed rituals for protection, leaving offerings at the ruined causeways, intoning the names of ancient gods, speaking in tongues meant to confuse vengeful spirits. Even among those who did not believe in ghosts, a haunting gravity lingered. The city, so carefully engineered against the sea, was no match for neglect. With a network of canals untended, mud choked the passages, and mangroves rooted themselves within the foundations. At each equinox, the high tide rose a little farther. Stones loosened as old roots shifted. Walls tilted under their own weight. And with every collapse, the city seemed to withdraw further from the world, becoming less history and more portent. In oral tradition, the reason for abandonment is always layered, practical, supernatural, and deeply psychological. On a material level, the effort to sustain a city on artificial islets dependent on constant labor to keep canals cleared, stones reset, harvests managed proved impossible once centralized control fractured. Without the resources commanded by a single dynasty, each new chief had to choose between propping up the lost grandeur of Nan Madol or investing in the well-being of their own clan. But on another level, abandonment felt like penance. Islanders believed that some rule, spiritual or communal, had been violated within the city's last days. The dynasty's pride, its insistence on tribute and the purity of rituals, had disturbed the natural order, inviting a curse or a withdrawal of divine favor. When the city fell, it was only right that the community step back, make amends, and let the spirit reclaim the ground. There is, too, a suspicion that the city itself rejected its people. In legend, the stones are not only placed by magic but inherit their own will. Left untended, they are dangerous, quick to anger or to mourn. Visitors or trespassers risk awakening this dormant power. Like so many ancient places, Nan Madol becomes the setting for every parent's cautionary tale. Do not disturb the city. Do not greedily pry loose a stone. Always greet the site, never leave without thanks. Expect nothing, demand nothing from the place that gave you your world. And yet, not all is fear. There are tales, scattered and softer, of those who have found luck at Nan Madol. A fisherman who comes with proper offerings finds his nets full. A healer who keeps silent reports herbs found nowhere else. Even marriages made at the site, with the right preparation and blessing, are said to be unusually fruitful, as if the old gods, long cut off from ceremony, still wished to reward respect. For generations, the haunted city changes only as slowly as coral grows. Early explorers, arriving from Europe or the edges of the Pacific, are at first awed, then frustrated, by the silence of the stones. They come seeking treasure, written records, or even a clue to some global mystery and leave with only rumors and the persistent sense of trespass. Each writer paints the city as a puzzle, but few are able to quiet the local warning to leave the stones be. In the 20th century, as researchers launch expeditions with new tools, camera, sonar, archaeological surveys, Nan Madol reveals some facts but withholds explanation. Analysis confirms the city's incredible scale, the complexity of its engineering, even evidence of multiple layers of settlement. But every new fact returns the same question: why was it left to ruin? No clear evidence of war or disaster. No catastrophe marks the end. Instead, there is the slow turning of the tide, the energy of a society dispersing, fragmenting, then giving up entirely, on a dream of unity that had grown too heavy. Nan Madol, so carefully planned, so masterfully built, simply becomes unsustainable. Its greatest strength, its grandeur, its reach beyond ordinary life is also its undoing. The city's ghost stories, far from being mere folklore, serve as instructions on what the community cannot afford to repeat. Ritual replaces residence. Vigilance replaces occupation. Where a king once watched for treason, all now watch for omens, warnings of disasters that might arise from a city once ruled by men, now ruled by water and memory. And so the city's abandonment is neither an act of cowardice nor just a fear of the unknown. It is the result, in the deepest sense, of a social contract instinctively rewritten. Never again shall one family hold so much power, never again shall the force of memory and myth be channeled into a single, stone heart. The price, for now, is distance, a respectful, fearful, and sometimes hopeful gap between the present and a past too weighty to revive. Nan Madol is not just an archaeological zone. It is a lesson and a warning, passed from mouth to mouth as the seasons change. Some say it is fragmenting a little more each year. Others insist it only seems smaller, its presence undiminished, its rules unchanged. To stand on its stones today is to feel both the allure and the menace of what has been left behind, a great city, abandoned not because it failed, but because it succeeded at a cost no one was willing to continue paying. Centuries slipped by before Nan Madol once again drew the prolonged gaze of outsiders. Where legend and taboo had kept the living at bay, the tides of curiosity and science finally began to trespass. Island silence gave way to the cautious steps of anthropologists, geologists, and adventurers with notebooks and cameras, all eager to crack the stone cipher of the ghost city. They arrived by steamer and outboard skiff. They came with supplies for weeks, hoping to write answers where the sea had written only questions. At first, the foreign team sought what any explorer craves: treasure, lost technology, revelations worthy of a headline. They found instead confusion, complexity, and the peculiar humility that always comes with deep mystery. The basalt walls, when measured and mapped, revealed order but no obvious logic. Some structures pointed east, others were rotated to the north, the pattern shifting but elusive. The artificial islets formed a lattice, yet nowhere could anyone find a guiding inscription, a layout plan, or even a scratched marker with intent. Each measurement raised a new question. Tools, those true testaments of lost labor, proved elusive. Early expeditions reported finding little more than fragments, broken adzes made from shell or coral, worn and useless for shaping basalt, and rare, small lump hammers whose use against 50-ton stone seemed both optimistic and grim. Explorers sifted mounds of coral rubble at the foundations, collecting handfuls of charcoal to mail off for radiocarbon dating. When the first samples came back from deep below the towering tomb walls, scholars blinked at the answers. The data said, quite plainly, that some construction predated the Sordala by centuries. Other dates locked neatly within the Dynasty S timeline, as if a series of architects had come, built, abandoned, and been replaced in a rhythm no one remembered. Even stranger, the numbers never added up. Every estimate of the total weight, the distance the stones had traveled, the number of workers required, only compounded the absurdity. Nan Madol contained close to 100 artificial islets, over 750,000 tons of basalt, some columns weighing 50 tons apiece, and no clear evidence of an agricultural or social base large enough to marshal such labor for decades, let alone centuries. Population estimates for pre-colonial Pompeii seldom reached more than 20 to 30,000 across the entire island, a number quickly swallowed up by the task of feeding, housing, and supporting a city whose construction should have required an empire. Geological surveys compounded the enigma. The nearest viable basalt outcrop suitable for megaliths lay 3 kilometers away overland, on the opposite shore of Temwan Island. Earlier writers posited that columns might have been rafted at high tide. Experimental archaeologists tried, in vain, to replicate those journeys. Rafts broke, stones sank, even the strongest tides could not float a 50-ton block over shallow coral flats without splintering beloved folklore against hard mathematics. Some stones appeared to have never arrived, lying forlorn and half-submerged along the foreshore, abandoned projects, reluctant casualties of nature and ambition. With each failed replication, the story thickened. No pulleys or levers, no evidence of wheeled transport, no depictions of raw labor carved into the basalt faces, nothing that could anchor the visitor in practical reality. Historians scoured oral histories, desperate for a practical detail, a forgotten sled, a feat of clever tidal timing, or even a lost communal madness. Instead, they always arrived back at the myth: flying stones, sorcerers, wind singing through woven palms. Anthropologists, wary of dismissing all local knowledge as fantasy, pressed elders and keepers of ancestral memory for explanations. Some hinted, in tight-lipped ambiguity, that the city demanded a price: a pact of obedience, communal unity, and, perhaps, ritual secrecy now long fractured. Others only offered caution: stones that defy nature require answers no living man or woman should reveal lightly. Drown yourself in the data, and the contradictions grow more vexing. Archaeologists unearthed precious few signs that a population large enough to construct Nan Madol actually lived there, even during its peak. Remnant fire pits, hearths, and detritus hinted at ceremonial feasts, not the bustle of daily life. The city, it appears, was never a true metropolis, more a ritual center, pulsing with imported labor and offerings, then emptying into darkness between the tides of religious calendar and political upheaval. The implication chilled more than one modern observer, a city ruled by logistics, not lifeways. Botanists joined the fray, analyzing pollen grains and seeds trapped in the mud beneath the stones. They found gardens plots for yams and taro, long gone feral, ringed now by mangroves reclaiming the canal banks. But none at a scale sufficient to feed thousands. The island's hills, surveyed for fortifications, yielded scattered stone platforms, ancestral house sites, no signs of state-sponsored agriculture or mass granaries. Nan Madol, built for glory, may have always relied on tribute, pulling sustenance from the labor of every chieftaincy within view, then collapsing when the network frayed. Others poked at the city's very bones. The royal mausoleum, most famously Nan Madol, yielded no mummies, no ranks of jeweled corpses. Instead, diggers found stratified layers, shells, ceremonial tools, a few human remains accompanied by artifacts, and the persistent, fossilized silence of unfinished business. If royal burials lay within the waters beneath, none who searched ever publicized their finds, nor returned for further work. Every question answered bred three more. Modern sonar scans of the submerged edges hinted at further anomalies, rectangular features, possible remnants of walls now covered by sand and coral. Yet each investigation alternated between cautious skepticism and wild possibility. Was the city always as small or as large as it appears? Did rising tides or local subsidence swallow entire districts, masking evidence of earlier construction? Or does the city's present form merely echo the ambitions of centuries, each leader building on the bones of earlier plans with no clear beginning or end? Within academic journals, debates rage in print and at conference tables where voices rise and fall like surf against ruined walls. Some theorists root for gradualism, the complex, multiphase development stretching over nearly 2 millennia, with each era adding, repairing, and abandoning in turn. Others point to the apparent lack of intermediate forms, no small experimental proto-Nan Madols, no failed stone villages, elsewhere, in Micronesia to propose a cultural leap, perhaps an imported tradition or a borrowed workforce whose homeland vanished below the sea. Both camps acknowledge the uncanny, a site too ambitious for its context. In the end, every modern investigation returns to absence of tools, of food storage, of population density, of unbroken memory. What is found are the shadows cast by doubt. And in the city itself, the stones, so well stacked, so precisely placed, seem to outlast the reach of any outsider's explanation. For the islanders who still skirt the ruins by boat, these scientific debates feel distant, even excluding. They feel what outsiders do not, ghosts in the stones, boundaries drawn by things older than the dynasty, warnings pulsing in the heart during afternoons when the sun burns low on the horizon and clouds pile up like mountains beyond the reef. The city's secrets, they say, were always meant for those willing to listen and never for those who only measure and record. And yet, perspective changes with every arrival. On occasion, a younger archaeologist or a curious traveler stands atop a basalt column at sunset, overlooking tangled mangroves and the shimmer where sea meets sky. They remember the tales of a city built for spirits and gods, not for commerce. They marvel at what survives, but also at what has vanished, erased by living water as easily as by time. No consensus has been found, only an uneasy truce among the facts. Nan Madol's construction reflects stubborn brilliance. Its abandonment, a lesson in the limits of empire. Its ruins, ever patient, still breathe with possibilities science cannot name, and memory cannot kill. The next visitor, the next theory, the next high tide all may find yet another piece, only to discover that the final answer remains somewhere under the surface, waiting, silent and immense as basalt drowned in the shifting tide. The question that will not die, the riddle that haunts every scientific paper and every midnight conversation among islanders, is simple in its asking and impossible in its answering. How did the stones fly? Not metaphorically, not as poetic embellishment, but in the visceral sense that oral tradition insists upon basalt columns rising, drifting, settling into place as if gravity itself had taken a holiday. The legends are too consistent, too detailed, too emphatic to dismiss as mere fantasy. Yet science, bound by its own rules, cannot accept magic as explanation. Between these poles, myth and measurement, lies a space where the most fascinating theories take root. The traditional account, repeated by generation after generation of Pohnpeian storytellers, describes the twin sorcerers Olasipa and Olasopa summoning a dragon to assist in construction. The dragon, in some tellings, is a creature of scales and fire, coiling through the air above the reef. In others, it is more abstract, a force, a wind, a shimmer of heat that bends the world. The brothers chant, or sing, or simply concentrate their will, and the stones respond, lifting free from the quarry, gliding over treetops and water, descending gently onto the growing platforms. Workers watch in awe, their labor reduced to guidance and placement rather than the backbreaking hauling that should have been required. Western scholars, encountering these tales in the 19th and 20th centuries, did what scholars do: they searched for rational explanations hidden within the mythological language. Perhaps, they suggested, the dragon was a metaphor for some lost technology, a technique so advanced or so unusual that witnesses, lacking vocabulary to describe it, resorted to supernatural imagery. This line of thinking opens fascinating possibilities, each more speculative than the last, each trying to bridge the gap between what was accomplished and what should have been possible. One theory proposes acoustic levitation, the use of sound waves at specific frequencies to counteract gravity and lift heavy objects. Modern physics demonstrates that intense, focused sound can indeed suspend small particles in air, and some researchers have successfully levitated objects weighing several grams using carefully calibrated acoustic fields. Could the ancient builders of Nan Madol have discovered this principle, perhaps accidentally, and scaled it up to move massive stones? The theory is tantalizing, supported by scattered references in other cultures to the use of sound, vibration, or musical tones in megalithic construction. Tibetan monks speak of stones moved by trumpet blasts and drumming. Ancient Egyptian texts hint at words of power that could make heavy things light. Could these be garbled memories of acoustic engineering? The practical obstacles are formidable. Levitating a 50-ton basalt column would require sound waves of extraordinary intensity and precision, generated by equipment far beyond anything the archaeological record suggests existed. The energy requirements alone would be staggering, and the sound would be literally deafening, creating pressure waves that would injure or kill anyone nearby. Yet the theory persists because it offers a physical mechanism, however improbable, that could explain both the legends and the physical reality of the stones in place. Another explanation focuses on bamboo rafts and tidal engineering, attempting to salvage the conventional theory despite its many failures in practical tests. Proponents argue that past experiments were too conservative, that builders with generations of accumulated knowledge might have achieved what modern recreations cannot. Perhaps the stones were not transported on top of rafts but suspended beneath them, hung from bundles of bamboo lashed together into floating platforms. Perhaps the builders used the twice-daily tidal flows, timing their movements to coincide with high tide, allowing the current itself to do much of the work. Perhaps there were intermediate staging areas, now submerged or eroded, where stones could rest between legs of a journey broken into manageable segments. These explanations require assuming a level of sophistication and patience almost as remarkable as magic. Each stone would need to be carefully prepared, balanced, secured to its raft, floated during a narrow window of optimal tide, guided through treacherous coral channels, and positioned with millimeter precision, all without modern tools, without metal cables or mechanical winches, without even the certainty that oral tradition claims the builders possessed. The theory asks us to believe in human ingenuity and persistence on a scale rarely demonstrated in history, to imagine a workforce so skilled and so committed that they could perform near miracles of engineering, with organic materials and collective will. A darker possibility emerges from anthropological study of other megalithic cultures. Perhaps the construction was not efficient at all, but wasteful, brutal, sustained by a social system willing to expend human lives as readily as basalt columns. The Easter Island builders, transporting and erecting their moai statues, may have triggered ecological collapse by deforesting the island to provide rollers and ropes for moving stone. Pyramid construction in Egypt and Mesoamerica involved corvée labor on massive scales, pulling workers from their fields, sometimes for years, sometimes at cost of life and limb. Could Nan Madol have been built on similar foundations, not flying dragons, but broken backs, decades of coordinated suffering, and a dynasty ruthless enough to demand the impossible from its subjects? This explanation fits the historical pattern but struggles against the evidence. Where are the graves, the skeletal remains showing the injuries typical of construction accidents? Where are the villages and agricultural sites that would have supported a vast labor force? Where is the infrastructure of oppression, the guard posts, the storage facilities, the administrative centers that managed such projects elsewhere? Nan Madol's surrounding landscape is largely empty of these traces, as if the city was built not by a civilization but by a ghost. Some researchers have turned to the stones themselves for answers, examining them for clues about how they were shaped and moved. Basalt is volcanic rock, formed from cooled lava, and the columnar variety used at Nan Madol forms naturally into hexagonal pillars as the lava cools and contracts. This natural geometry was exploited by the builders, who selected columns that were already roughly the right shape and size, requiring minimal modification. But even so, extracting these columns from the bedrock quarry would have required breaking them free at both ends, a task that leaves characteristic marks: percussion fractures, wedge holes, or shear planes where the stone separated from its parent rock. Early surveys reported finding few such marks, leading some to speculate that the builders had a method of breaking stone that left little trace, perhaps heating the rock and then rapidly cooling it with water, causing thermal shock that fractured the basalt along natural planes. Perhaps they used organic wedges wood driven into cracks and then soaked with water, swelling with enough force to split solid rock. Perhaps they simply waited, exploiting natural weathering and frost action to weaken the stone over months or years until it could be freed with minimal effort. Each method has precedence in other cultures and could explain the lack of obvious tool marks, but none has been definitively proven at Nan Madol. The most radical theories abandon physical explanations altogether and embrace the possibility that the legends are literally true, that the builders possessed knowledge or abilities now lost to humanity. This is the realm of ancient astronaut theory, which proposes that extraterrestrial visitors or survivors of a vanished advanced civilization assisted or instructed the builders of Nan Madol. The evidence cited is circumstantial but provocative: the apparent impossibility of the construction given known technology, the similarity of megalithic sites across vast distances suggesting a common source of knowledge, and the persistent legends of gods or sky beings who taught humans the arts of civilization before departing or perishing in some ancient catastrophe. Mainstream archaeology rejects these theories as unfounded speculation, arguing that they underestimate human ingenuity and overinterpret myth as history. Yet the questions remain. Why did the builders leave no developmental stages, no crude prototypes or failed experiments visible in the archaeological record? Why do the construction techniques at Nan Madol appear fully formed, as if imported complete from elsewhere, or inherited from an earlier tradition that left no other traces? Why do the legends emphasize the foreignness of the founding twins, their arrival from a distant land whose location is now forgotten or submerged? Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing between magic and engineering, but in recognizing that ancient peoples may have understood aspects of the physical world that modern science has forgotten or dismissed. Sound, resonance, leverage, the behavior of materials under specific conditions. These are areas where practical knowledge accumulated over generations could produce results that seem impossible to those who lack the tradition. The dragon of legend might be a symbol for a technique, a tool, or a principle that worked, but was never written down, passed only through demonstration and apprenticeship until the chain of transmission broke with the fall of the Sordler dynasty. What remains is the city itself, silent testimony to the fact that somehow, impossible or not, the stones were moved and the walls were built. 92 million tons of basalt did not arrange themselves. Whether by magic or method, by dragon or by determination, the builders of Nan Madol accomplished something that challenges every assumption about what should have been possible for a society without metal tools, without writing, without any of the technological markers we associate with advanced civilization. The stones are there, precisely placed, perfectly balanced, surviving centuries when the knowledge that created them did not. That is the mystery, the achievement, and the legacy that no theory has yet fully explained or adequately honored. What lies beneath the surface matters more than what the eye can see. This truth, obvious to any diver or oceanographer, becomes urgent when applied to Nan Madol. The visible ruins, those 92 artificial islets rising from the reef, may represent only a fraction of what once existed, with older, deeper structures hidden beneath meters of water and centuries of accumulated sediment. If true, this possibility transforms Nan Madol from an isolated mystery into a window on something far larger and more ancient, a lost Pacific civilization, drowned by rising seas, remembered only in fragments and folklore. The Pacific Ocean has been rising for 12,000 years, ever since the great ice sheets began their final retreat at the end of the last glacial period. At the height of the Ice Age, global sea level was more than 120 meters lower than today. Coastlines extended far beyond their present positions, islands were larger or connected by land bridges, and vast stretches of what is now seafloor were dry land, habitable and potentially inhabited. As the ice melted, the ocean reclaimed this territory relentlessly, drowning river valleys, submerging coastal settlements, transforming archipelagos into isolated dots on an ever-widening sea. For the Pacific Islands, this inundation was catastrophic. Entire landscapes vanished beneath the waves, taking with them any structures, artifacts, or evidence of the people who had lived there. Modern bathymetric surveys reveal the ghost geography: submerged plateaus, drowned reefs, underwater terraces marking ancient shorelines now far below the surface. If human communities existed on these lands during the Ice Age or the early Holocene, their remains are now inaccessible, buried under sediment or encrusted with coral, visible only as anomalies in sonar scans or chance discoveries by deep-diving submersibles. Nan Madol sits on the eastern edge of this drowned world. The Pompeii Lagoon, where the city's islets cluster, is shallow, rarely more than a few meters deep at low tide, but just beyond the reef the seafloor drops steeply into the abyss. Sonar mapping of the offshore slopes has revealed features that do not fit the expected geological pattern. There are terraces too regular to be natural, linear features that might be walls or roads, angular blocks scattered across slopes where no volcanic activity should have deposited them. These anomalies lie at depths of 20 to 30 meters, submerged for at least 8,000 years based on sea level curves, suggesting that if they are artificial, they predate the accepted chronology of Nan Madol by millennia. Underwater archaeology in this region is difficult and dangerous. The water is deep, the current strong, visibility often poor due to plankton blooms and sediment stirred by waves. Equipment failures are common, funding is scarce, and the political complications of working in remote island nations add layers of bureaucracy to every expedition. Despite these challenges, a few teams have ventured into the depths, driven by the tantalizing possibility that Nan Madol's visible ruins are merely the tip of a much larger complex, the remnant of a civilization that thrived when sea levels were lower and the Pacific was a different world. In 1996, a Japanese team led by marine geologist Masaroki Kimura conducted extensive underwater surveys around Pohnpei, using remotely operated vehicles equipped with cameras and sonar. They documented several structures on the seafloor that appeared artificial rectangular formations, stacked stones, what might have been foundation walls or platforms. The team was cautious in their interpretations, noting that natural geological processes can sometimes produce features that resemble human construction, but they could not rule out the possibility that some of what they found was man-made. The structures were partially buried in sediment, their surfaces obscured by marine growth, making definitive identification impossible without excavation that the team's equipment and budget could not support. Local legends gave these findings added weight. Pohnpeian oral tradition speaks explicitly of two underwater cities, Karnim Namket and Karna Huezo, said to have existed before Nan Madol and to have been destroyed by divine punishment or natural disaster. The stories describe these cities as similar in construction to Nan Madol itself, basalt structures arranged on artificial islands but larger and older, built by people whose names and origins have been forgotten. When the underwater surveys discovered anomalous features in locations consistent with the legendary accounts, researchers took note. Perhaps the legends were not pure fantasy but preserved memories of actual settlements, lost when the sea rose and the coastline changed. The connection to a broader Pacific Atlantis theory became unavoidable. If Nan Madol had older, submerged predecessors, and if similar structures existed around other Pacific islands, then perhaps there had been a maritime civilization spanning the ocean, linked by trade and shared culture, destroyed or fragmented by the post-glacial flooding. This civilization would have left few traces on land because its settlements were coastal or island-based, precisely the areas most vulnerable to inundation. What remains visible sites like Nan Madol, Easter Island, the megalithic structures of Polynesia would be the survivors, the highest or most recent constructions, while the majority of the civilization's works lie drowned and forgotten beneath the waves. The theory is speculative but not absurd. We know that sea level rise drowned vast areas of coastal lowland. We know that human populations have occupied Pacific islands for at least 40,000 years, with evidence of sophisticated seafaring and navigation dating back millennia. We know that oral traditions across Oceania speak of lost lands, sunken cities, and catastrophic floods that separate the present from an earlier age. What we don't know is how advanced these ancient Pacific peoples were, what they built, what they achieved before the rising sea erased the evidence. Parallels with other parts of the world strengthen the argument. In the Mediterranean, underwater archaeology has discovered entire cities submerged by tectonic subsidence or sea level change. Pavlopetri in Greece, Heraklion in Egypt, multiple settlements along the coast of Turkey. In India, divers have found massive stone structures off the coast of Gujarat, submerged remains that some researchers argue date back thousands of years beyond accepted chronologies. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Monument, a massive underwater rock formation with terraces, steps, and angular features, has sparked fierce debate about whether it is natural or artificial, with some geologists insisting it is a worked structure from a time when the site was above water. If such structures exist in the Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, and Western Pacific, why not in the Central Pacific as well? The technology required stone working, megalithic construction, organized labor is demonstrably present at sites like Nan Madol and Easter Island. The motivation, population pressure, religious devotion, political competition is universal across human societies. What was missing in the Pacific was not capability but visibility. not achievement but preservation. The ocean took what the land could not protect, and for thousands of years, the evidence lay beyond reach, accessible only to fish and imagination. Modern technology offers hope of changing this. Multibeam sonar can map the seafloor with resolution measured in centimeters, distinguishing artificial structures from natural formations. Autonomous underwater vehicles can explore depths too dangerous for human divers, transmitting high-definition video and collecting samples without risking lives. Satellite imagery, processed with algorithms trained to detect anomalies, can sometimes identify underwater features, from the way they affect surface waves or water color. Each technological advance brings the submerged past closer to revelation, makes it more likely that evidence of ancient Pacific civilizations will eventually surface. But technology alone is not enough. Excavating underwater sites is expensive and slow, requiring specialized equipment, trained personnel, and permits from governments often wary of foreign researchers disturbing culturally sensitive locations. Interpreting what is found is equally challenging. A rectangular stone lying on the seafloor could be a building block, a natural formation, or a piece of ballast dropped from a 19th-century ship. Context is everything, and context underwater is difficult to establish when currents have moved objects, sediment has buried details, and marine life has colonized surfaces. The most tantalizing evidence remains frustratingly ambiguous. Yes, there are anomalies around Pohnpei and other islands. Yes, some of them look artificial. Yes, they are consistent with legends of drowned cities. But looks artificial is not proof, and legends are not reliable historical documents. The scientific consensus remains cautious. Interesting features deserve further investigation, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and so far the evidence is insufficient to declare with certainty that a lost Pacific civilization built cities now lying beneath the waves. Yet the absence of proof is not proof of absence. The ocean is vast, deep, and largely unexplored. Even in well-studied areas like the Mediterranean, new discoveries happen regularly: shipwrecks, settlements, artifacts emerging from obscurity as technology improves and searchers look in new places. The Pacific is orders of magnitude larger and less explored, its floor a patchwork of mapped and unmapped regions, its shallow reefs often too complex for simple sonar, and its deep trenches beyond the reach of most equipment. If ancient structures exist, if Nan Madol is indeed the visible remnant of something larger, the evidence is still out there, waiting to be found by someone with the right tools, the right funding, and the willingness to search in places others have overlooked. For now, Nan Madol remains poised between two interpretations. It is either an isolated achievement, built by a single culture in a single period, impressive but explicable within known historical frameworks. Or it is a survivor, the last above-water fragment of a larger maritime civilization, its drowned companion cities lying somewhere in the blue depths beyond the reef, their stones and stories slowly dissolving into the patient, forgetful sea. The truth, as always with ancient mysteries, lies somewhere between speculation and evidence, waiting for the next expedition, the next technology, the next low tide that might reveal what has been hidden, or confirm that some secrets are meant to remain beneath the surface, out of reach and beyond recovery, forever. Not all of Nan Madol has been seen. Not all of its stones have been counted, its channels mapped, its secrets revealed. Despite more than a century of archaeological attention, vast portions of the city remain unexplored, choked by jungle, growth, submerged beneath tidal waters, or simply too dangerous to approach without equipment and permission that few researchers possess. What lies in these hidden spaces is unknown, and the unknown breeds both caution and wild speculation. The largest and most imposing structure at Nan Madol is Nan Madol, the Royal Mortuary Complex. Its walls rise 25 feet above the surrounding water, constructed from massive basalt columns stacked in the characteristic crisscross pattern. The walls are thick, some sections measuring 17 feet across, forming an enclosure that once housed the tombs of the Sordla dynasty's highest rulers. But the visible structure is only part of what exists. Below the main platform, sealed chambers and vaults extend into the coral foundation, accessible through narrow passages now blocked by fallen stone, sediment, and the accumulated debris of centuries. Early explorers reported these underground spaces with a mixture of fascination and dread. In 1907, German ethnologist Paul Hambruch spent weeks at Nan Madol, documenting structures and collecting oral histories. He was told by local guides that beneath Nan doors were burial chambers containing the remains of the Sordla kings, interred with treasures and ritual objects, sealed by massive stone slabs that no one had moved in centuries. Hambruch attempted to enter these chambers but was turned back by structural instability and the rising tide that flooded the passages twice daily. He left with sketches and descriptions but no artifacts, no proof beyond the testimony of his guides. Later expeditions faced similar obstacles. In 1963, a Smithsonian team arrived with the goal of excavating Nan doors, hoping to recover skeletal remains that could be dated and analyzed, providing definitive evidence of the Sordla chronology. They cleared vegetation, removed topsoil, exposed the upper layers of the structure. But when they attempted to penetrate deeper, they encountered water. The chambers below the main platform were flooded, the water black and stagnant, its depth unknown. Without pumps or diving equipment, they could go no further. The team departed having confirmed that sealed spaces existed but unable to access or document what they contained. The flooded chambers present a technical challenge that has never been adequately solved. Pumping out the water would require sealing the passages to prevent tidal refilling, a task complicated by the porous nature of the coral foundation and the constant pressure of the surrounding lagoon. Diving into the chambers is dangerous due to limited visibility, the risk of entanglement in submerged debris, and the possibility of structural collapse triggered by disturbing centuries of accumulated sediment. Remote sensing technologies, ground-penetrating radar, electromagnetic induction have limited effectiveness in waterlogged environments where signal absorption and scattering make interpretation difficult. Yet the chambers call to researchers and treasure hunters alike, promising answers to fundamental questions. If the Sordla kings were indeed buried in these vaults, their remains could be radiocarbon dated, providing independent confirmation of the dynasty's timeline. Grave goods, if any survived, would offer insights into the material culture, trade networks, and religious practices of the ruling class. Inscriptions, though unlikely given the absence of writing elsewhere at Nan Madol, might exist in these most sacred spaces, carved on stone or preserved on organic materials that the sealed environment protected from decay. Local tradition adds layers of supernatural deterrence to the practical obstacles. The underground chambers are said to be guarded by spirits, the lingering presence of the dead rulers who do not welcome disturbance. Stories circulate of researchers who attempted to enter and were struck by sudden illness, equipment failures, or simply overwhelming dread that drove them back to the surface. Whether these accounts reflect actual experiences or serve as cultural boundaries meant to protect sacred spaces is unclear. But they are effective. Few local workers will assist in excavations that involve the tombs, and guides routinely refuse to enter certain structures even in daylight. Beyond Nan doors, other structures contain unexplored spaces. Panwi, a large platform in the upper city section, has compartments beneath its surface that have never been fully documented. Painiat, another ceremonial islet, shows evidence of underground construction, possibly storage chambers or ritual spaces carved into the coral foundation. At least a dozen smaller islets have features depressions, sealed openings, aligned stones that suggest hidden cavities below. Each represents a potential repository of artifacts, human remains, or architectural secrets. Each remains largely inaccessible due to funding limitations, political sensitivities, and the sheer difficulty of working in such challenging conditions. There is also the question of what has been lost or destroyed before modern documentation began. Nan Madol has been subject to periodic looting, vandalism, and misguided attempts at treasure hunting for more than a century. Colonial administrators, visiting sailors, and local residents seeking building materials have all removed stones, disturbed structures, and, possibly, opened chambers that were then resealed by nature or deliberately by those who feared what they had found. Oral histories speak vaguely of discoveries: carved stones thrown into the sea, metal objects sold to traders, bones reburied in secret locations none documented, all now impossible to verify. The possibility of intentional concealment adds another dimension. If the Sordler dynasty knew it was falling, if the last rulers had time to prepare for conquest, they might have hidden the most important artifacts, sealed the most sacred chambers, taken measures to ensure that the civilization's spiritual center remained inviolate even if political control was lost. This pattern appears in other cultures facing collapse: Egyptian pharaohs sealing pyramid chambers, Incan priests hiding temple treasures, Mayan rulers filling sacred wells with offerings before abandoning their cities. The archaeological record is full of such acts, final gestures of defiance or preservation, and there is no reason to assume the Sordler behaved differently. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2008 and 2013 detected multiple anomalies beneath the surface of several major structures. The data showed voids consistent with chambers or passages, areas where radar waves penetrated deeper than expected, suggesting emptiness rather than solid fill. The surveys also revealed denser zones that might represent concentrations of stone or metal, though the resolution was insufficient to determine specific objects or materials. These anomalies were catalogued, marked on maps, reported in technical journals, and then largely forgotten as funding priorities shifted and access permissions became complicated. The reality is that excavating Nan Madol's hidden chambers would require substantial investment, specialized equipment, international collaboration, and, most crucially, agreement from the Pohnpeian government and local communities who consider the site sacred. These requirements are formidable. The site is protected as a UNESCO World Heritage location, which brings prestige but also regulatory oversight that prohibits destructive or invasive research without extensive justification and approval. Local control means that any excavation must align with community values, respect cultural protocols, and provide benefits to the island beyond academic publications. Some argue that the chambers should remain sealed, that what lies beneath Nan Madol is meant to stay hidden, that opening tombs and disturbing the dead serves no purpose beyond satisfying curiosity. This perspective, common among indigenous communities worldwide, values preservation and respect over knowledge extraction. It asks whether the potential gains from excavation dates, artifacts, answers to historical questions justify the disruption of sacred spaces and the violation of ancestral remains. The question has no easy answer, balancing as it does between competing values, scientific inquiry versus cultural sovereignty, the pursuit of knowledge versus the protection of heritage. Others insist that the chambers hold crucial evidence, that understanding Nan Madol's full story requires accessing these sealed spaces, that history belongs to humanity as a whole and should not be restricted by contemporary political or religious considerations. This perspective, more common in academic circles, prioritizes discovery and documentation, arguing that knowledge once lost can never be recovered, that the opportunity to learn from the past is fleeting and must be seized before decay, climate change, or political instability makes it impossible. The tension between these views plays out in permit applications, funding decisions, and community meetings where archaeologists present proposals and local leaders weigh the costs and benefits. Progress is slow, negotiations complex, outcomes uncertain. Meanwhile, the chambers remain sealed, the voids beneath the stones filled with water and darkness and possibility, waiting for a resolution that may never come or may arrive too late, after the structures have collapsed and the evidence has been lost to the same ocean that claimed so much else. What is certain is that Nan Madol has not yet revealed all its secrets. The visible ruins, impressive as they are, represent only the accessible portion of a larger complex that extends vertically into the coral and horizontally into areas now overgrown or submerged. Each generation of researchers adds fragments to the picture: a new date, a refined map, a technology that sees through stone or water, but the full story remains incomplete. The hidden chambers, whether they contain royal burials, ritual treasures, or simply empty spaces carved by ambitious rulers, hold pieces of that story, pieces that will remain hidden until technology, politics, and cultural values align to allow their exploration. Until then, Nan Madol keeps its deepest secrets, locked in stone and water, guarded by tradition and the practical difficulties that have always protected the city from complete understanding. There are places on Earth where the past refuses to stay buried, where stone and water conspire to ask questions that no generation has successfully answered. Nan Madol is such a place. After a century of expeditions, measurements, theories, and debates, the essential mystery remains intact, perhaps even deepened by what has been learned. The city still stands, its basalt columns defying both gravity and comprehension, its origins obscured by the very persistence of its ruins. Every answer discovered at Nan Madol seems to generate 3 new questions, each more fundamental than the last. We know the stones are basalt, quarried from Temwan Island, stacked without mortar into walls and platforms of remarkable precision. But we do not know how they were transported across terrain and water that should have made such movement impossible with available technology. We know the construction dates to sometime between 1180 and 1400 CE based on radiocarbon analysis of organic materials in the foundations. But we do not know why earlier dates cluster around 80 to 200 CE, suggesting occupation or construction phases that predate the Sordler dynasty by a millennium. We know the city was abandoned shortly after 1628, following the conquest by Isokellical and the collapse of centralized authority. But we do not know why subsequent rulers chose not to reoccupy such an impressive capital, why the artificial islands were left to mangroves and tides rather than repurposed for new dynasties and new ambitions. We know that local oral tradition speaks of flying stones, twin sorcerers, and underwater cities. But we do not know how to reconcile these persistent, detailed legends with the silence of the archaeological record, which offers no tools, no developmental stages, no clear path from primitive settlement to megalithic marvel. The questions extend beyond Nan Madol itself, reaching into the broader mystery of Pacific prehistory. If the builders possessed the knowledge to construct this city, what else did they achieve that has not survived or has not been recognized? If they moved 50-ton stones across water and coral reef, what prevented them from leaving other traces of such capability? If they organized labor on the scale required for Nan Madol, where is the evidence of the social hierarchy, the agricultural surplus, the population density that should have supported such efforts? These are not rhetorical questions but genuine gaps in understanding, spaces where evidence should exist but does not, where logic demands explanation but finds only speculation. The conventional narrative of Pacific settlement, waves of migration spreading from Southeast Asia, populations adapting to island environments, cultures developing in relative isolation, struggles to accommodate Nan Madol. The city does not fit the pattern. It is too sophisticated, too sudden, too complete in its execution to align with gradualist models of cultural evolution. Alternative theories attempt to fill the gap but bring their own complications. If Nan Madol represents imported knowledge from a more advanced source, whether vanished Pacific civilization, contact with distant cultures, or even extraterrestrial intervention, then where is the evidence of that source? If acoustic levitation, tidal engineering, or some other lost technology explains the construction, why was it not used elsewhere, not preserved in other forms, not transmitted to successor cultures who could have benefited from such knowledge? The truth, if there is a singular truth, likely lies somewhere in the uncomfortable space between what we want to believe and what we can prove. Human ingenuity is vast, capable of achievements that seem impossible to later observers who lack the accumulated knowledge, the cultural context, and the sheer determination that drove the original builders. The pyramids of Egypt, once attributed to aliens or Atlanteans, are now understood as products of sophisticated Egyptian engineering, organizational capacity, and religious devotion remarkable but human. Perhaps Nan Madol deserves similar respect, acknowledgement that the builders, whoever they were, possessed capabilities we have not fully recognized rather than capabilities beyond human reach. Yet respect for human achievement does not require abandoning all questions or accepting incomplete explanations. It is possible to honor the builders of Nan Madol while simultaneously admitting that significant aspects of their work remain unexplained, that the techniques they used, the knowledge they possessed, and the cultural context that motivated such efforts are not fully captured by current archaeological models. Mystery and achievement can coexist. Indeed, they often do. The most profound human accomplishments frequently carry with them elements that resist complete understanding, that preserve a kernel of wonder even after centuries of study. Nan Madol forces this acknowledgement more than most sites. Standing among the ruins as the tide rises through the canals, watching the sun set behind walls that have weathered 7 centuries of storms, it becomes impossible to maintain purely clinical detachment. The stones speak, if not with words then with presence, with the mute testimony of weight and placement and endurance. They say, "We are here, we were moved and stacked and shaped by people whose names you do not know, for purposes you can only guess, using methods you cannot replicate. We outlasted the dynasty that built us, the conquerors who replaced them, the colonizers who documented us, and the skeptics who tried to reduce us to simple explanations. We remain, and we wait." For the island of Pompeii, Nan Madol is both burden and heritage, a constant reminder of a past more complex than comfortable narratives allow. Tourism brings money but also disruption, with visitors treating sacred sites as photo opportunities, guides simplifying legends into sound bites, and developers eyeing the ruins as economic resources rather than cultural treasures. Preservation requires funding that the island government struggles to provide, while international assistance often comes with conditions that compromise local control. The city is deteriorating, slowly but measurably, its stones shifting, its foundations eroding, its structures collapsing into the rising sea. Climate change accelerates the decay. Sea level rise, storm intensity, and changing precipitation patterns all threaten structures built for a different climate regime. What survived centuries of gradual change may not survive decades of rapid transformation. Some estimates suggest that within a century, significant portions of Nan Madol will be permanently submerged, accessible only to divers, lost to surface observation and casual exploration. This adds urgency to documentation efforts, but urgency alone does not generate the resources needed to stabilize structures, clear vegetation, map unexplored areas, and answer the questions that have accumulated for generations. There is also the philosophical question of what should be done. Should Nan Madol be restored, its walls rebuilt, its platforms reinforced, turned into a museum-quality attraction that preserves appearance at the cost of authenticity? Should it be left to natural processes, allowed to erode and collapse, as its builders' descendants have largely chosen, respected, in its slow return to the reef? Should it be excavated aggressively, its hidden chambers opened, its secrets extracted before rising seas make access impossible? Or should it be protected but minimally disturbed, documented but not altered, studied but not violated? Different stakeholders answer differently. International archaeologists prioritize knowledge extraction, arguing that what is learned benefits all humanity and justifies careful intrusion. Local communities often prioritize respect and continuity, valuing the city's role as sacred space and ancestor memorial over its potential to answer academic questions. Conservation organizations focus on physical preservation, advocating for structural reinforcement and erosion control regardless of cultural debates. Government officials balance tourism revenue against preservation costs, seeking compromises that satisfy no one completely. Meanwhile, the stones continue their patient existence, indifferent to debates about their future, silent witnesses to all the theories proposed and discarded, all the expeditions launched and abandoned, all the questions asked and left unanswered. They have outlasted the Sordeler, the colonial period, the early archaeological investigations, and they will likely outlast current controversies as well, persisting until the sea finally claims them or until some future generation finds the resources and the will to preserve what remains. Perhaps that is the real lesson of Nan Madol, not the specific story of who built it or how, but the larger truth about human achievement and the limits of knowledge. We create monuments that outlast our civilizations, build structures that future generations cannot fully explain, leave mysteries embedded in stone and water that resist every attempt at simple resolution. The past is not a closed book with answers in the final chapter. It is an ongoing negotiation between evidence and interpretation, between what we can prove and what we can imagine, between the stones that remain and the knowledge that was lost. Nan Madol stands as testament to this truth, 92 million tons of basalt arranged in patterns that challenge understanding, speaking in a language of weight and precision and endurance that we can measure but not fully translate. The city asks us to be humble, to acknowledge that human history is deeper and stranger than conventional timelines suggest, that capabilities and knowledge can be lost as easily as they're gained, that the ocean keeps secrets we may never recover. And it asks us to keep questioning, to resist comfortable answers that ignore inconvenient evidence, to maintain the tension between skepticism and wonder that drives genuine inquiry. The stones did not move themselves. Someone, somehow, quarried them, transported them, placed them with care and skill that speaks across centuries. That someone deserves to be understood, honored, remembered, even if full understanding remains forever beyond reach. The final question Nan Madol poses is perhaps the most important: what will we choose to remember, and what will we allow to be forgotten? Every generation makes this choice, consciously or not, through what it preserves and what it neglects, what it studies and what it ignores, what it protects and what it lets the sea reclaim. The choice matters because memory matters, because the past shapes the present in ways both obvious and subtle, because losing connection to what came before diminishes our understanding of what we are and what we might become. Nan Madol will not last forever. The ocean is patient, the climate is changing, and stone, however massive, is not immune to time. One day, perhaps sooner than we think, the city will slip beneath the waves completely, joining whatever other structures lie hidden in the depths, becoming another legend, another lost civilization, another mystery that future explorers might glimpse but never fully solve. Before that day comes, while the stones still rise above the tide, while questions can still be asked, and investigation still launched, the city offers an invitation to wonder, to question, to acknowledge the limits of certainty, and to find in those limits not defeat but the space where knowledge grows and understanding deepens. The stones are waiting. The mystery endures. And the answer, if it exists, remains somewhere in the spaces between stone and water, between legend and evidence, between what we know and what we can only imagine about the people who built this impossible city in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.